Welcome back to another episode of the Portlandian here. Today we're going to be continuing the top 10 greatest game consoles of all time list with number 9, a game console that sold extremely poorly in North America, yet around the world it sold rather well, and in some regions it even outsold Nintendo. And I am of course talking about the Sega Master System. The Sega Master System was released in June of 1986, a mere 8 months after the release of the NES, and that gap of time killed its ability to succeed in North America, because in the United States and Canada, Nintendo had signed on with most third parties by that point and had them on an exclusivity contract with them, meaning even if those companies wanted to go ahead and make games for the Sega Master System because it had superior hardware to the NES, they wouldn't be able to because of Nintendo. It's a shame that it had to be ignored by third parties because it was such a great piece of hardware, but that didn't slow Sega down at all. They ended up making a fantastically diverse library of games for the system, and even though the Sega Master System failed, a handheld version of it called the Sega Game Gear ended up coming out and having a even larger library of games and a larger audience at that. But enough about the Game Gear, let's focus on the Master System. If you look at the console, it's very wide, but not very deep. It's got a very unique shape to it. It's kind of like a pyramid, so it's really hard to see one and get it confused with any other console in history. It's really unique, very much its own thing. It has a cartridge slot on top, just for your standard old cartridges, but it also has a card slot on the front, which you can use for what are called Sega cards. And they essentially work the exact same way as Hue cards over on the TurboGrafx 16. You just plug them in, and then you have a game. The controller for the Sega Master System was pretty basic. There was no starter select like on the NES gamepad, but you did have a fully diagonal controller with a 1 and 2 button. Not really a whole lot, but again, it worked for all the games in the 8-bit era that you would really want to, because start and select only really pauses the game, and there's a pause button right in the console itself. Why waste space on a controller? Now, the Model 1 controller for the Sega Master System had a cord coming out of the side of it, and that's pretty strange. I've never seen it happen again with a controller, and it seems that Sega learned their lesson because every future iteration of the controller had the cord coming out of the top. If you don't have a Sega Master System controller and you have a Master System, you can always plug in a Sega Genesis controller and it still works. The Sega Master System also had the Sega Light Phaser, an extremely precise light gun that was the winner of my first Versus episode, the NES Zapper versus the Sega Light Phaser. The games came in plastic boxes, which Sega would adopt for their Genesis games as well, and it really set a tone for the industry. If you look at the NES, Super Nintendo, or N64 games, they all came in cardboard boxes that deteriorate, get crumpled on shelves, and really they're just hard to keep looking good. But Sega knew what was up. They knew that plastic would hold over time. It would be easier to shelve your games, and they would look better. They would be more durable during transport, and I don't know why Nintendo never adopted this. But if you look at these boxes, they're awesome, and they stand this test of time. These games have been around since the 80s, and they look great. Now, about the game boxes, they had terrible artwork. I don't know what was going on over at Sega or any of the third parties that worked with them, but they did not know how to design artwork for the life of them, which is why I did mine with designs I put together myself. But again, none of this talks about why this game system should be on my list. Now, all this history and looking at the hardware is fine and dandy, but why is it number 9? Why is it above the Sega Saturn? Well, they were both really good at arcade ports. They both had a pretty nice library of games, but I feel that the Sega Master System had even better games. Games like Phantasy Star, easily one of the best RPGs ever created. It's a Sega exclusive, and thus debuted on the Sega Master System. And at the time, it blew us all away. It looked way better than Dragon Warrior, it looked way better than Final Fantasy, and it just blew me away the first time I played it, and I didn't play it until about 4 years ago. And I was still floored about how good this looked for the time. You also had games like Altered Beast. Yes, it was on the Sega Genesis, and it was a pack-in title when it was released in 1989, but it also came out on the Master System, and it wasn't terrible. You had Alex Kidd, which was a very fun and unique platformer from Sega, and they were trying to create a mascot on par with Mario, and they failed, but the games were still a lot of fun. You also, of course, had Wonder Boy, which would evolve into an entire series of its own, and be ripped off simultaneously by Hudson Soft and ported over to the NES as Adventure Island, which would sadly become more popular. You also had ports of games that were just better on the Sega Master System. Games like Double Dragon, which allowed you to play 2 players at the same time, just like the arcade. Arcade. The NES version, not so much. Or Choplifter, which looks leagues better than its Atari 7800 counterpart. The system was simply just more powerful and capable than any other 8-bit system of its time. And it's a shame that Nintendo had these fascist policies in place that kept third parties away from the Sega Master System, because I'm sure if they could, they would have developed gems of. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and to buy or sell any of the games or consoles discussed in this episode, go ahead and visit GameGavel.com, the only auction site built by gamers for gamers without the high eBay fees.